So I have a question. If Joseph Smith really restored the gospel, we should be able to look back to ancient prophets and their teachings, and we should see that those line up with what Joseph Smith taught, right? Well, on this episode of the podcast, I have a conversation with Ken Peterson. Ken is a devout, lifelong member of the LDS Church. He recently released a book titled Mormon Doctrine in the Apocrypha. In the book, Ken lines out where teachings from the Apocrypha are exact matches to the teachings of the restored gospel as taught by Joseph Smith. We cover Ken's backstory, how he got involved writing this book, his process in selecting material, some of the content of the book, and ultimately what Ken hopes that the book will do for Mormons. That's next on this edition of the Mormon Renegade Podcast. So I just want to take a moment to thank you, the listener. When I started this podcast, I wasn't sure if anyone would really listen. Now, to my surprise, this thing has taken on a life of its own. And that's all due to you, the listener, spending your time here with me, and it means a great deal to me. Now, as a husband and father, I'm keenly aware of how important time is. It feels like there's just never enough of it. So when you are spending your time here listening to this podcast, I feel a responsibility to never waste your time. In that spirit, as this podcast has grown, I feel like I need to do you, the listener, justice. I want to continue to produce good content and upgrade the audio quality. That takes better equipment and better software, and that all takes money. Now, I've tried to advertise, but you'd be surprised. There's not a lot of people wanting to advertise on a Mormon Fundamentalist podcast. I know, surprising, right? Now, if you want to help support the podcast, you can do that one of two ways. The first is go over to MormonRenegade.com and hit the Donate tab. There you can make a one-time donation, or you can go ahead and set it up to be a monthly recurring donation. Your choice entirely. Now, option number two, because I'm a capitalist, if you want to head on over to MormonRenegade.com, click on the store button, you're going to find that we've got some new swag out. We got some t-shirts, we have a tote, we have cell phone cases, water bottles, coffee cups. We got a bunch of stuff, and more is going to be on the way. So, if you feel like that's something you could do, again, head on over to Mormon Renegade and check all that stuff out. If you're not in that position to do so, I completely understand. We're all squeezed right now with high gas prices and high inflation. So even if you can't, please keep listening and maybe keep the podcast in your prayers so we can continue to grow, produce good content, and better audio quality. Thank you. Ken, thanks for being here, man.
Thanks for having me.
So
I'm just glad you appreciate the book.
Yeah, no, I've had a couple days to go through it, and I think it's absolutely phenomenal. I mean, the way that you lay it all out, the way you are able to say, "Hey, go here and look for," you give your references, so it makes it real easy to do your own research too, which is absolutely awesome.
Good.
So, real quick, were you born LDS? Were you raised
Yes.
Mormon?
Yeah, I was raised in one of those little Mormon towns in Wyoming. Probably one of the lesser known communities in the Bighorn Basin area. It was one of the last colonization efforts in the church, a place called Cowley.
Okay.
Named after the disfellowshipped apostle Matthias Cowley.
Okay. All right. What was that like? Was that kind of cool being raised out there?
It was paradise.
Was
paradise. It? I mean, when I was growing up, in the 60s and the 70s, we didn't have much. We had dirt roads, and our water supply was not great. But as a kid growing up there, it couldn't have been more beautiful. The summers seemed to last forever. Everybody, to this day, the community's much improved. Purest water in the state, paved streets and sidewalk, curb and gutter now. And it's I love to go back and visit. I have lots of family there still today. My mother still lives there in the same house I grew up in.
Wow.
It was wonderful. One of those communities you get on your bike and your mom would say, "Well, come back for dinner." And you'd go wherever you wanted with your friends and mess around and have good, wholesome fun.
I moved my family, I want to say well over a decade now ago. We moved to a little town just south of, just north of Twin Falls called Shoshone. Mm-hmm. And it was like stepping back 75, 80 years in terms of just a tiny little town, kind of isolated, had everything there you needed, had a grocery store, gas station, few places to go and eat. but by and large, it was just kind of like a town time forgot.
Yeah.
And I remember when we moved from the western Treasure Valley in Idaho, Boise, Nampa, Meridian, and we moved out there, it felt like we could breathe, right? We could just let the kids kind of wander around a little bit and didn't have to worry as much. And it was so nice. And it broke our hearts when we had to leave there. That was right before the collapse of '08, and we had to go look for work other places. But yeah, I miss that kind of environment all the time.
Well, we're to this day, my wife and I are tempted by a community like that, especially Cowley, lots of family around. It would be ideal to raise our children,
Right.
but the question is, as adults, how would I support us there? That kind of a thing,
Right.
because there's really no money.
Right. Technology is a great thing. I mean, I'm doing this by technology, right? We can
Yeah.
talk all the way across the state in
Yeah.
real time, but sometimes I think we've lost something too a little bit. So,
Oh, I'd much prefer having this conversation in person. I mean,
yeah.
yeah, there's no question in my mind.
Yep. Yep. So, what was it, a strong LDS home? A lot of gospel teaching and that sort of stuff in your home?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
My mom and dad, both devout, Latter-day Saints, both had been raised Latter-day Saints. My mom's side, gosh, probably third or fourth generation Latter-day Saints. On my father's side, maybe two generations. But it wasn't, if you've heard the term Uber Mormons,
Right. Yep.
just a little bit on the crazy side of things. My parents weren't like that at all. They loved us. And to give you an example, would have home evenings fairly regularly and family prayers, but they never made us, coerced us to believe or to do anything like that. And I remember very distinctly my dad telling me, said, "Son, you know what I believe, but you have to figure it out for yourself." And so they were, we talk about Moroni's promise that if you do your own, invest your own time in research, that God will tell you, so you don't have to believe anybody else. And as we'll discuss during our time together, I'm a natural born skeptic. And plus all the schooling I've had, I'm a secularly trained scholar, which only exacerbates your skepticism.
Right.
I don't believe anybody at face value. I don't take anybody at face value. I need you to give me concrete reasons to take your word for it. And that was my approach to the restored gospel. So a very loving home. I have six siblings. I'm the fifth, and they were all devout. And so there was that kind of a natural reinforcement. I wasn't, in terms of peer pressure, I didn't understand what that was, because my family, my brothers and sisters were my peers, and they were good to me and they were exemplary. And I had no reason, I never felt any need for outside validation. So it left me kind of independent of the trends of what was going on in the world, what my friends were not doing, because what mattered most to me were the opinions of my siblings and my parents. And not because they forced me to, but because they were good to me. And I could see how good they were, and I respected that. So, in all earnestness, I wasn't particularly scholarly as a kid. I was interested in motorcycles and girls and basketball and that sort of thing. But as a junior in high school, you reach kind of a choke point in your life where it's like, it's going to be this or that, right?
Right.
And that's when I really invested myself in a cold, hard look at the truth claims of the Latter-day Saints.
So real quick, being a skeptic, and I can identify with you. I mean, I remember when I was first reading the Book of Mormon and I got my confirmation that it was true. I was like, I don't want to be a Mormon. They're kind of crazy, right? I don't want to do this because I'm naturally skeptical, right?
Right.
but that confirmation you can't deny. So you got to kind of put some things in faith. Was there a time during your upbringing where you were questioning things quite a bit? Because I mean, on the surface, if you are a skeptic, that whole Joseph Smith first vision thing, that's bat crap crazy, right?
Well,
I mean,
yeah, it's funny you should mention that. My first memory of hearing the account of the first vision, I was sitting in Sunday school or something, 6 or 7 years old, and I distinctly remember thinking to myself, well, he's lying.
right,
My best friend across the street makes up stories better than that all the time, just to get attention. It was far easier for me to believe that he was just trying to get attention than that he was telling the truth. I mean, and trying to aggrandize himself as being the prophet of God, etc. So from the very get-go, I was skeptical, even as a kid. I never sat there and went, I believe. You tell
right.
me, I believe whatever you tell me. I never was never like that. I don't know why. And I love to meet with people who don't come by their faith naturally, or they're not, and I wouldn't call myself a spiritual person either. I do believe I have received revelation and insights through the Holy Ghost, but that is only as the result of priming the pump, as they say, investing the work and looking and doing comparative analyses, studies, and I, I can't even begin to tell you everywhere I've looked. I've gone down every rabbit hole that I know of because I'm one of these guys that I don't like to be ignorant of anything. In any case, so I was always skeptical. And it wasn't until much later in high school when I began to be exposed to archaeological discoveries that were extraordinary. And one of my formative experiences was I served a youth mission in Bozeman, Montana, and I was still actively searching for a knowledge of what is true, because I still didn't know at that time. Well, actually, at that time, I just had this transformative experience where I first had some concrete knowledge in my mind that, oh my gosh, Joseph Smith was telling the truth. And I was so excited. And we went to this appointment with this Christian, evangelical Christian, who knew the Bible inside and out. You could see it. His Bible was just the pages are all curled.
Yeah.
So I went in there with my bright, shiny new testimony and was telling him, what I knew to be true. And he proceeded to bind and gag me with his Bible. And I was utterly embarrassed, not because he had diminished my beliefs, but because I still knew what I knew, but I was so ill prepared to defend what I knew. I was embarrassed that I couldn't, when it actually came down to discussing the nuts and bolts of Christianity, at least as a starting point, I was a failure. And I vowed to myself at that very moment that I would never let that happen again. That if I were going to be a representative of what I had come to understand to be true, that I was going to do a lot better at being able to defend what I knew to be true. And I've spent my life pursuing that since then. I never looked back. I was 17 at the time. And since then, I've never questioned. Well, I always question. I'm always asking the questions because it's still unbelievable. It's the craziest story ever told, number one. Number two, I mean, I understand perfectly well how the world views Joseph Smith and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, because that's my viewpoint. That's the skeptical viewpoint.
Right.
And it is fantastical. Add to that, I mean, what are the odds, honestly, against you and I being born at this time in the 4.5 billion history of this globe and being a part of this I mean, they're astronomical. They're impossible odds. It's just a coincidence that you and I are born here and now with this silver spoon in our mouth. That's the hardest thing for me to believe.
Yeah, the science of statistical probability rule that out entirely, right? I
And
mean,
yet here we are
yep,
at the pinnacle of human development.
yep.
So that's amazing to me.
Let me ask you this: what was it that ultimately converted you to the gospel?
Matthew chapter 7. I want to read it because I want to make sure I get it right. I remember I was on this youth mission. I had a great companion who was very patient with me. And so I just dove in. And I remember thinking, if Jesus Christ really was who he said he was, he would know of my dilemma and he would know what to tell me. And miraculously, shortly after that, I was reading in Matthew chapter 7, verse 15. It says, beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. So the first question is, well, which was Joseph Smith then? Was he a ravening wolf? Or was he the real deal? Because Jesus is admitting that there were going to be false prophets. You will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles? And to a skeptical mind like me, that's like, duh. Well, of course. I mean, this is science. That's what it is.
Right.
Even so, every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, and a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast in the fire. Wherefore, by their fruits you shall know them. And even though I wouldn't call myself a scriptorian by any stretch at that time of my life, I had been raised in the middle of this faith. And I remember sitting in the car, we were going to some appointment in Montana, and I had these questions and ideas swirling around in my mind. And I had committed myself that I was going to study every religion on the face of the earth so that I could personally, Ken Peterson, figure out which one I wanted to be affiliated with. Then, of course, as soon as I thought of that, the thought occurred to me, well, that's impossible. Because there are new religions being established every day. You will never, ever, you could spend your whole life, you can't do it. It's impossible for Ken Peterson to figure that out on your own. And it's funny that the revelation comes at a point of desperation and humility.
It always does. Yep.
I was desperate enough. I really couldn't move forward without some understanding, number one. Number two, it was abundantly clear to me that on my own, I was never going to happen. It was at that moment that I had this, what did Joseph Smith call it? I got to read that. I love this. I'll tell you about this in a second. But
No, you're good.
Joseph Smith described it, a person may profit by noticing the first intimation of the spirit of revelation. For instance, when you feel pure intelligence flowing into you, it may give you sudden strokes of ideas, and thus by learning the spirit of God and understanding it, you may grow into the principle of revelation until you become perfect in Christ. Give you sudden strokes of ideas. The science world calls that the eureka moment, where suddenly it hits you, and you didn't think of it. It doesn't feel like you thought of it. Anyway, so here I was in my moment of desperation and abject humility, going, what am I going to do? And suddenly all of these things that were swirling, these pieces that were swirling around in my mind came together. And revelation took what I did know, which wasn't a lot, but it was significant because I'd grown up in the middle of it.
Right.
And put it in the context of Matthew chapter 7. Every good thing in my life, including the good choices that I made, were a direct result of what Joseph Smith restored. And it was interesting because I'd grown up in this Mormon bubble, and now here I was in the world And it was eye-opening to me that it was not the same, that everything I loved about where I grew up was a direct result of the restoration through Joseph Smith. Everything I didn't like about the world was the absence of all of that. And to my young mind, that was undeniable fruit. There was no accident. And I wasn't alone in that. Everywhere I looked, in every devout LDS community, LDS family, you saw those same wholesome, positive, healthy, good traits. An evil tree cannot bring forth, a corrupt tree cannot bring forth good fruit. Anyway, that's where it started.
And it's fascinating. And the more I talk with people, the more I realize that everybody's road to the recognition of who the Savior is and who Joseph Smith is comes in a little bit different way, right? I remember when I was praying to get my answer about the restored gospel, it was a very strong feeling to my core that I could not deny. And it happened quickly and it happened suddenly.
Right. It's instantaneous, isn't it?
Right.
It's like, what? I get it, yeah.
And then I hear your story, and I've heard very similar stories where it's kind of a gradual process a little bit, and then it works up to something, right? And we approach it from different things. I have this experience that changes me fundamentally to my core, right? Quickly, instantaneously. And it's all done from the heart. It's all work on the emotions and in the heart. You come at it from a very academic point of view, a very scholarly point of view. But here's the thing. It accomplishes the same thing. And it's so beautiful to me that the Lord works with who we are. He doesn't seek to necessarily change who we are at our core. It's about being able to work with us where we are and then bring us to a knowledge, an understanding of the truthfulness of the gospel per our strengths, which I find amazing. Because here's the thing, right? Being an emotional guy, what we're doing, this works great for me. This works fantastic for me. You as a scholar, I'm just guessing, love research. You love tearing it apart, putting it back together, seeing how it works. And in some levels, I think, and this is the genius of the program, I guess, if you want to say it that way, we all kind of need each other that way, right?
You're singing my song.
Without Ken Peterson doing this research that I want to talk to him about, without the natural gifts that he's given, and I would say that being somewhat skeptical is absolutely a gift, right? Because
we all have different gifts. Yeah, we all do.
You dug deep, right? And so I don't know. I think it's just genius the way it all comes together.
An LDS scholar called it the law of individual differences. And the Book of Abraham points this out, that none of us are the same. We never have been the same. And then, of course, the Apostle Paul puts it all together when he compares the church to the body.
Yeah.
That the fact that we're all different is necessary for the body to function. If we were all the same, the body wouldn't function.
Right.
So our differences are not something that we put up with. Our differences are things that we should celebrate.
Yep.
And I love, that's one of my favorite hours of the entire week is gospel doctrine. And I get to teach it. I'm teaching it now. But to be able to share our comprehension, understandings, testimonies, feelings regarding the most profound concepts known to man, he nearly called them the terrible questions, is fascinating because there is something to learn from every single other person because they're coming at it from a slightly different angle. And now to bottom line that, we are invaluable to God because of that very thing. Each of us as individuals are irreplaceable in the grand scheme of things. In my Father's house are many mansions. I have created a place for you. That's what he says in the Doctrine and Covenants, past tense, that there is a place for each of us in the eternal scheme of things that can be occupied by no one else.
Yeah.
We're irreplaceable,
You know,
invaluable to God.
and that's something I didn't know until I became a father myself, right? And we all, at least I did, when we started having kids, me and my wife, I always thought, okay, these will just kind of be like spitting images of me and my wife, right? Nothing could be farther from the truth, right? My kids, while they certainly have certain characteristics of mine, both physically and in the way they act, and the same can be said of my wife, right? Her, our daughters have her characteristics physically and in the way they act. At the end of the day, they're still people, and they still have come up with things on their own because they are people.
I can't wait to see how they develop and who they become.
Yeah.
It's like opening a gift and watching it. I mean, I would be the last thing I would want is to see a copy of myself.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
But as you say, it's also a very interesting eternal question. Why do we have similarities at all?
Yeah.
I have
I
ideas, but I'm not going to mention them online.
What's been fascinating to me, are you a grandfather yet?
Yes.
I have two. In fact, one's living with us right now. His mom and is about to have another baby. So we're like, let's take the
congratulations,
grandbaby for a while. What's been most fun is to see my kids raise their kids. And that has been just absolutely fun and fascinating on a whole nother level. But yeah, no, I think we need each other. We need each other's gifts because we all have something to contribute here, right? I mean, this isn't a zero-sum game in the sense of, some of us are going to excel and others of us won't. I think it's a matter of finding out how it is you click with the gospel and then use that strength and at the same time develop those weaknesses a little bit.
Well, and in the end, choose exactly where you want to fit in this grand scheme.
Right.
As you say, it's not binary. It's not black and white. And as Section 76 shocked the world, that the degrees of glory, well, let's take it further. Section 88. There is no space in which there is no kingdom, and there is no kingdom in which there is no space, which suggests a potential infinite variety of glories that we can choose to be a part of by our own volition. There is no other way.
Absolutely. So you have your experience, you go on a mission. Did you enjoy your mission?
Loved it. Like I said, I served, it was called a youth mission. I grew up in the Montana Billings mission. That's where northern Wyoming, that's the mission it was in. And they were having a shortage of missionaries, a number of them that went home at the same time. So they, to priest age young men who were interested, they allowed us to go out and serve for a month or two.
Oh, wow.
With full-time missionaries. And that experience changed my life for the better. That's where I kind of had the right circumstances to be able to spend the necessary time pondering, studying, and asking God about these things. And I had a great companion and formative experiences that established that foundation for me. Anyway, the other thing that happened to me on that mission that was the seedling for the book. This was in the late 70s, 1978. There were cassette tapes circulating around, copies of copies of copies. And they'd have writing on this little cassette tape, the Dead Sea Scrolls tapes.
Ooh.
My companion was like, "Ooh, you need to listen to this." I'm like, "What?" I hadn't heard anything about it. And there was some of the very first paperback printings of what was available then of the Dead Sea Scrolls were just beginning to be published. Theodore Gaster's first paperback edition, like 1976, something like that. And the Latter-day Saint, some would call him an amateur scholar, Einar Eriksson, was giving these sensational lectures about the corollaries between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the restored gospel. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, I mean, and this is a wonderful test case because the Dead Sea Scrolls were hidden from the world for 2,000 years. They predate Christ, and they weren't discovered until 1947, I think. So we dig them out of a cave,
In
dig
some
them out of
jars, right?
right. It's jars that had been sealed with bitumen. So here we had these people writing their most valuable sacred texts, burying them in the earth for safekeeping to be discovered at a later date. Who else believes that? That's crazy, first of all. And then they had a ruling council of 12 and a presidency of 3. They had ritual purifications by immersion, and all kinds of these things that only Mormons really thought we kind of believed in. So that fascinated me. My mind was first blown open to the fact that there are other sacred writings in this world that are not a part of our Bible, nor the Book of Mormon. But as Latter-day Saints, we are taught in 2 Nephi that a Bible, we already have a Bible. We have no more need of a Bible, that there are other sacred records to come forth. So that was my initiation to that, and I was terribly excited about that. Much later, in fact, just a few years ago, I got to meet Einar Eriksson toward the end of his life. And he invited me over to see, he lived here in St. George. He invited me to see his library. I went down, his library was his basement. And his basement had the same square footage as the main floor. And it was nothing but a library.
Wow.
Wall to wall books. And I think he'd read all of them. He was amazing. And so forthcoming and so giving of his time. He's recently deceased. And a lot of people looked at him askew because he didn't come out of Brigham Young or any academic circle. But he was certainly well read. Anyway, so then my full-time mission was in Japan, the Japan Fukuoka mission.
That's a heck of a change.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I was at first a little disappointed because I didn't want my mission to be about language. I wanted my mission to be about doctrine. I wanted to go to the Bible Belt, and I wanted to crunch through the New Testament with people. And but God knows us better than we know ourselves and what we need. The Japanese people were, how do you put it in a word? They were wonderful. They treated us quite wonderfully. Not everybody, but most. And my mind needed to see more of a worldwide perspective of how God views this plan and his children and how that all fits together. But I would have to say the single greatest and most significant occurrence of my mission was one of my last companions. His name is Joe Swick. And he was my junior companion. He was the smartest missionary I'd ever met. He was a convert to the church as a teenager, very well read, a prolific reader, gave the missionaries a very hard time, and had a miraculous conversion experience. I don't think I have the right to say it on the air, but
Sure.
to make the long story short, he was the opposite of me. I wanted the miracle without doing any of the work. He did all the work and never asked God. They were filling the font, and the missionary was giving him the interview. Do you believe the Book of Mormon to be the word of God? No, I don't. Do you believe Joseph Smith was a prophet? No, I don't. Well, we've answered all of your questions. He says, yes, you have. Did you pray about it? He says, no, I haven't.
Oh,
In their zeal to answer all of his questions, they neglected the key. So in terms of pondering and working it out in his own mind, he'd done all of that in spades. And so the missionary, while the phone was filling, said, well, let's each of us go and pray. And because of everything that was in his head, he had a very miraculous conversion experience. In any case, we hit it off beautifully. We had so much fun as companions, and our companion study time was revelatory. But his great gift to me was Hugh Nibley. I'd never heard of Hugh Nibley. This is in 1980, 82. And Farms had just started their work. And at the time, all Farms was doing, they were photocopying Nibley's lectures and stapling them. And you could buy these photocopied lectures, for like $1.80 or something for each of them. So I had this whole stack of Nibley lectures. And he introduced me to Farms, to Hugh Nibley and the LDS intellectual milieu, that whole scholarly approach to the restored gospel, which fit me to a T. I loved Hugh Nibley.
Real quick, explain, because I do have some listeners who aren't Mormon or LDS. What was Farms?
Foundation for Ancient Research and Mormon Studies. It was a nonprofit organization formed, and I was in some burned out building on campus. And their initial goal was to publish the works of Hugh Nibley. That's all they were wanting to do. Hugh Nibley was the smartest Mormon who ever lived. And if you don't believe me, Farms completed that work 40 years later. And the work is a photograph of it somewhere. The Collected Works of Hugh Nibley.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's 20, that's 20 volumes. When I'm talking volumes, I'm not talking about 100-page volumes. I'm talking, in some cases, 1,000-page volumes of original writing, original thinking, things that no one else has discussed or put down in print before. All the product of one mind. He was a genius by all accounts. And because of an early experience in his 20s, he had a life after death experience, which set the stage to humble him so that he could become a more effective purveyor of this knowledge, so that his pride was out of the picture and he could do what was really important. So yeah, that was the purpose of the origin of Farms, is to publish the works of Hugh Nibley. It expanded into much more than that, publishing the works of John Sorensen, the late great John Sorensen, who was the great anthropologist who laid to this day the most thorough case for Book of Mormon geography. He knew the Book of Mormon inside and out. Anyway, and John Welch, the discoverer of chiasmus in the Book of Mormon, and all of these, they began publishing. They were a magnificent resource for people like me. And that was my companion, Joseph, what gave me that gift. And anyway, I will always be grateful to him for setting me down that path. Because what Hugh Nibley showed me, he opened the door. Einar Erickson opened the door of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Hugh Nibley opened the door to all these other, we should call them extra-canonical writings, sacred books that are not a part of the Bible.
Right.
The most confusing thing about the title of my book, Mormon Doctrine in the Apocrypha, Apocrypha can mean either the 14 intertestamental books between Malachi and Matthew that you'll find in the Roman Catholic canon, or in a more general sense, any sacred text that is not a part of the canon, more appropriately known as extra-canonical.
Now, Joseph
And
Smith had
how many of those works are?
Right. Joseph Smith had I believe it's in the Doctrine and Covenants. He'd actually
It
mentioned the
is. Yeah.
Apocrypha before.
Yeah.
What was Joseph's take on the Apocrypha?
That there are many things that can be learned therefrom if one is guided by the Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not all inspired. So his approach to all other learning, seek ye learning from the best books, right? And so I took what Joseph Smith advised regarding the intertestamental Apocrypha and applied it to the broader meaning. Because how many of these other extra canonical writings, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, are there? That was my first question when I started reading Hunibli and having my mind blown yet again. Oh my gosh, how many of these things are out there? Because as much as I admired the mind of Hunibli, I was still skeptical, or I was skeptical of Einar Erickson. That's nice, guys. I appreciate your enthusiasm, but I want to read these texts for myself because I want to see if you're telling me the truth. So that began in my 20s, my early 20s. I began to find and collect my own library of extra canonical writings. And there are hundreds.
Yeah.
Hundreds of them. So I collected all I could find, and I think all that there are, although they're still being published today. A new volume of extra canonical writings, New Testament Apocrypha, was published a month after I published my book.
Wow.
And there's already stuff in there that I'm going to have to add to a second edition.
Right. So when you get home from your mission, you meet your wife. What do you decide you're going to go to college and study?
I, for whatever reason, I love to sing.
Okay.
And I was really good at it. And I had scholarships. So all my schooling was paid for because I would sing in their programs.
Wow.
And I was enthralled with the singing of Luciano Pavarotti, if you remember,
Yep.
arguably the greatest tenor of the 20th century. And I aspired to do that, as crazy as that sounds. You know, a kid in northern Wyoming listening to Italian opera and wanting to sing Puccini, not having any idea what that entailed, but I was just going to go for it. And so I did. I met my first wife at Ricks College, BYU, Idaho, where I was studying singing and was singing in Pirates of Penzance, the role of Frederick, and had a wonderful experience there. From there, I had a scholarship to sing for Arizona State University. They had a very demanding and advanced musical theater degree program where I sang in musicals, operas, and operettas. From there, I went to Utah State, where I met and studied with Michael Ballum.
Wow.
Who was a saving influence in my life and career. Had a marvelous experience there, got my bachelor's degree, and then staying at Illinois State University for my master's degree in voice performance. Started teaching and ultimately got my terminal degree, a doctorate of the arts in voice performance and pedagogy at the University of Northern Colorado. So I spent the next 28 years teaching singing in higher education, which is what brought me to St. George to teach at what the time was Dixie State College, and taught there for 16 glorious years, had marvelous successes and award-winning productions, and hundreds of great students. And it was just an ideal atmosphere. But as all things do, that came to an end. The administration did a number on me, and that was the end of that career. So
Gotcha. And this whole time you're just collecting books of the
Apocrypha,
right? I mean, this whole time you're just going through and you're collecting these. Now, during this process, and we should probably make sure we define the Apocrypha for what it really is. It's, as you were saying, extra canonical books, right?
Correct.
By various authors. I believe most of the ones that were in the Dead Sea that were found with the Dead Sea Scrolls were produced by the Gnostics, if I'm not mistaken.
No.
Okay.
No, they're not.
And that's why I have people on smarter than me.
They're not. they're not exactly sure who produced them. Many think it was the Essenes that
Okay.
produced them, but they were found near the community of Qumran, which is on the shores of the Dead Sea, which is a very interesting area. I mean, it's very arid. You really can't sustain populations there. But they had buildings and they had dining halls and they had plates and they had all these records there. And so we don't even know. What we do know is that the cast of priests that were there were critical of the priests in Jerusalem, and that the priests in Jerusalem had gone astray. So we're not exactly sure if they lived there or if they just gathered there to share their writings and to have conferences. But it's hard to say. But no, they were not the Gnostics. They had nearly amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are copies of most of the Old Testament. We have the oldest surviving copy of the book of Isaiah from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is fascinating in and of itself, a beautiful large scroll. They also discovered what's called the Temple Scroll, that the people in Qumran had plans to build their own temple.
Wow.
Basically a blueprint, which is critical for Jews because they want to rebuild their temple and they didn't. How are we going to do it? They didn't have blueprints. Well, now they do, thanks to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Then they had a copper scroll, which is interesting to Mormons.
Yeah.
Ancient writings written on metal plates. Oh, go figure.
Who'd have thunk it, right?
Who'd have thunk it? Anyway, the Dead Sea Scrolls, they do figure significantly in my book. Not because of those things per se, because what I was looking for were teachings. And there are teachings straight out of the temple from the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's extraordinary. An endowed Latter-day Saint will read those texts and go, oh my gosh, how did that get there?
Right. So real quick, as you're accumulating all these books, do you ever have an idea of, you know what I'm going to do with this? I'm going to write, and as I've thumbed through it, I like to say it's like McConkie's Mormon Doctrine, but comparative between what Mormonism believes and what was taught in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, in fact, we were talking earlier. I'm a great admirer of Bruce McConkie. And yes, I fully realize that not everything he put in Mormon Doctrine was factual. But I have an incredible appreciation for what he did. In the age before computers, this man single-handedly put together the first encyclopedia of Mormonism.
Right.
By himself. Encyclopedic. And it's magnificent. And he was humble about it. I mean, there was a certain amount of confidence that comes with being so well-versed and so well-read as Bruce McConkie was. But when the first presidency called him into their office and said, you know, this is a nice book, but there are some things in here we're concerned about, his response to them was, I will do whatever you brethren tell me to do. And so I'm trying to remember who it was. I think it was David O. McKay that they assigned to work with him for his last edition of it, in which he made many corrections, very humbly so. But yeah, it was a standard model, and it's easy for us to look down on it today in the age of computers, or we can, you know, with the touch of a button, have access to the corpus of the world's knowledge. I remember what it reminds me of. When the very first digital LDS library was produced, it's called the LDS Collector's Edition, like 1997 is the first one I was aware of. The box that it came in, it had recommendations of various scholars on the back. One of them was Hugh Nibley. Hugh Nibley was recommending this new digital library. What did he say about it? He said one sentence: I wish I'd had this 40 years ago. Because when he was doing all of his stuff 40 years ago, he had to go to the library, physically find the book, copy it on a note card, and go home.
Right.
So when he was preparing to write a book, he'd have these stacks of note cards on his desk that he would use to write footnotes and to notate stuff. I can't imagine. I mean, I grew up in that era to some extent, but the book that I produce today, it never would have happened prior to the digital age. Never
Right.
could have happened.
So as you're collecting this, are you getting the feeling that, hey, I want to write a book, or are you collecting this more like this is for me and for my
Of course.
my
I
interest?
mean, I couldn't have any concept of a book because I didn't even know what I was trying to wrap my arms around. I mean, so my first question is, how much of this stuff is out there? What does it say? How does it relate to me as a Latter-day Saint? So I began, and so I was searching out this stuff, looking, I'd read Nibley, then he'd have these extensive bibliographies, so I could go to the source. But thanks to Amazon in the modern age, I could get all of this stuff, most of it digitally, in PDF documents. Then, of course, it took time to read it. And then my friends would say, well, what does it all say? And I would immediately get tongue-tied. Where do you start?
Right.
It was way too much stuff. I love the topical guide, the LDS topical guide in our printing of the LDS Bible, of the King James Bible, the LDS printing of it. And I thought, man, if I could organize all of this stuff like the topical guide, that would be helpful. So I'll make notes in the margins of my topical guide when I'm trying to relate scriptures that aren't already in there. And I thought, hey, I'm going to start doing that with these extra canonical texts. I'm going to footnote them like the topical guide is footnoted. So I go to my topical guide in my Bible and have it all there. What a brilliant idea, until I realized there are going to be more footnotes to these extra canonical texts than there are to the biblical texts. There's, as I wrote in my preface, there's not enough room in the margins to do that, even if I could. And so in order for me to be able to answer the question, the other question I had to answer, of all of these hundreds of extra canonical texts, which of them are actually useful? Some of them are flawed, deeply flawed. Some of them are false,
Right.
falsely attributed. Yes, my name is Paul, and I'm teaching you to be celibate. And of course, scholars have looked at many of these falsified documents and have deciphered that they're false because the acclaimed author, or the supposed author, is referring to things that Paul could not have known about.
Right.
Something from their later time period creeps into their writing, and it's clear that this guy's taking upon himself the name of Paul to try and sell his idea. Copyright was not a thing back then. So we have to be careful in these texts to determine which are useful and which are fallacious. So the first question is, how am I going to study these and be able to, if a friend were to ask me, what do you think of this book? I have to be able to give them some sort of an answer. I mean, you have to have an opinion about it, right? And so it occurred to me, the only way to make sense of this, the idea eventually came to me that I had to build an alphabetical, topical concordance of these things for every, what I wanted was a complete concordance for the whole corpus, but that would take teams of scholars.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't do that. What I could do, given enough time, I could read through all of these hundreds of texts, tens of thousands of pages, and identify LDS teachings that would present themselves in these texts. That could be, I mean, because our teachings are so distinct from the rest of the Christian world that those teachings just jump out at you. It's like, wait a minute, that's Mormonism, that shouldn't be there. What's that doing there, right? So I had no idea to begin with how many texts there were, nor did I know how many corollaries I would find. So I couldn't see the forest for the trees. And even once I began to discover them, there were so many, there's no way you can keep track of it all up here. So I started to build this alphabetical database, a topical concordance of extra canonical writings dealing with LDS teachings. And so that idea was seared into my mind at least a decade or two ago. And it was endlessly frustrating because my life was already full. How in the world am I going to have time to do this? I believe this is a very important thing, but how am I going to get this done?
Right.
And then I lost my job. And then the pandemic hit. I'm sitting there with time on my hands and I'm going, hey, now is the time before I embarked upon my next business adventure, which I'm doing now. Um, let me treat this as a sabbatical and do it. So I spent months finalizing all of this stuff, compiling it all into a single text. And I did not know until it was finished what the end result would look like. There's no way I could. And the end result was extraordinary, more than I anticipated. I counted 179 distinct LDS teachings in 66 different ancient texts, none of which were known to the world until after the life of Joseph Smith. The world didn't know anything about these texts, most of them until the 20th century. That's
Wow.
crazy. That's crazy.
You know, there's a lot there in that last part. I kind of I want to unpack a little bit and talk about. One is what you said, that you just feel it on your heart and you have to do that. I can totally identify with that. When I was laying in my hotel room at 2:30 in the morning for work, right? Because look, it was a time where, and it doesn't happen frequently, but there was this time where I was away from home more than I was home, right? Out and about
Yeah.
across the country. And I never sleep well when I'm away from my family. I just don't,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So
Yep.
I'm laying in bed and I'm looking up the ceiling, and thinking about what more can I do for the gospel, for the Lord, you know, in you know, as a fundamentalist Mormon, what can I do? And the thought of a podcast came in, and I was like, I don't have time for that. I don't have time for that.
Yeah.
Look at where I'm at. Look at I am in a bed in Tyler, Texas. I can't sleep. This isn't going to work. And then as soon as I said that, kind of like an excuse, and I probably am God's most difficult and petulant child, because I was like, I can't do it. I wish I could. I don't have time. Sorry, you know, my bad. Don't have it. My circumstances changed to where I got a ton of free time. I got a promotion, and now I can do this. And I had no more excuses. The next thing is that we looked at COVID as a really horrible thing. And for a lot of folks, it was. I don't want to minimize that. However, I do believe that the Lord, in his infinite knowledge, blessed a lot of people during that time.
Oh, sure.
To come out of that. You came out of it with a book that is, by all accounts, sweeping in its vision, right? And what you've been able to do here is absolutely amazing. So with all this said, you start compiling this stuff, right? Now, had you already made like notes about where where certain restored gospel teachings were during that time in COVID, so you could go right to it and you go, okay, this is where this fits and that sort of thing?
That was the only way I could do it. I mean, I have a fairly good memory, but I don't begin to have the kind of memory to remember where everything is. And I do this with all of the books that I read that are important to me. I'll mark them up, leaving a trail of breadcrumbs so I can find them again. I initially started doing that with my scriptures. As I said, I vowed I would never be caught unprepared again. And if you look at my scriptures, you see them. I was in church one day marking up my scriptures. My daughter said, "What are you doing? Are you decorating your scriptures?" And I'm, yes, I'm decorating my scriptures so I can find stuff. Because I'm just not, this book that I've produced was first and foremost for me. I'm ashamed of the fact that you read all these marvelous texts, and then I'm tongue-tied because I can't tell anybody anything about them because I can't remember. Now I have something. Now I
Right.
have a book. And now I can remember it all because it's alphabetized and it's indexed, and there's no excuse for me not to be able to know this stuff now. That work is done. I would have paid a fortune for someone else to have done that, but
Right.
but I'm. It was fun. The process was fun. But so yeah, so I would read all of these texts, and I have a very specific marking system that I've developed over the years. Very simple, to the point, which makes perfect sense to me, and is easy. I have a partial um, photographic memory. I don't have a photograph, but I do. If I hadn't played football, I might have a photographic memory now, but not too many brain cells around. But I remember how things look on a page, so I
Okay.
can flip through and I can see the marking because I know what book it's in. So I can, it makes it easy for me to find. And then I have a tabbing system. I'll tab the book, so again, easy access. Um,
So you
so I
almost
did,
prepared to write this book in your research, right? Without realizing you were going to write a book, you already had set yourself up through
right.
through through
Fortunately,
through
right.
probably the promptings of the spirit, right? So you could find all this again. And so when COVID hits, if I'm understanding the chronology here, you now have the time. You're no longer employed with what used to be Dixie State, and you can now devote yourself to this work of getting this book out.
That's exactly right.
And it's like it's already been prepared. All you have to do now, and I don't want to minimize it, right? Because writing
Right.
a book is
No, but
difficult.
you're right. You're right. That once the reading was done, once the doctrines had been, the teachings had been demarcated, it was simply a matter of compiling, which was, I mean, the whole thing was fun. It was like a treasure hunt. And the reason I was marking these stuffs, you find a treasure, you don't want to lose it. And the thought of forgetting, you read this, you go, I don't ever want to forget this. 6 months later, you've forgotten it. That stuff drives me crazy. So I go to great ends to be able to find stuff again. And
Yeah,
man, could you imagine if you could remember everything you've ever studied?
I
Would that be
know.
amazing?
I know.
That would be amazing.
You know what drives me nuts is when something leaves just a strong impression on you that you can quote it word for word, but you can't quote where you saw it. To me, that drives me nuts. So,
Well, which is why in Messiah, it teaches us line upon line, precept upon precept, here a little, there a little. To him that saith, to him that receiveth will I give more. From him that saith, I have enough, shall be taken even that which he has. That part of mortality, it's not a one-time a test of our devotion. It is a daily, I mean, because immortality, because we're constantly forgetting things, it is a reflection of how badly we want it. Because if we want to keep it, it has to be uh, a daily process, daily effort put into it for us to be able to keep the truth of our existence in our minds. Or as Ezra Taft Benson said, a testimony is not something we receive only once. It is to
right.
receive, it is to have current inspiration to know that the work is true.
Yeah, I think that's a great point because I don't think you're ever done building a testimony, right? And I
You're
can
either, you're either moving forward or you're moving backward. You never
I
stagnate.
I remember so and most people who listen to the podcast know this. I'm a land surveyor by profession, right? So I would spend at this point in my career I'm about to talk about, I would spend about I don't know, 2 or 3 days in the field and then 2 or 3 days in the office, right? And if I don't get out in the field a little bit, I start to go stir crazy in there
Yeah,
a little bit,
yeah.
right? And I tore my ACL once and just laid me down, right? I mean, it's the surgery, it's 6 months of rehab before you really start to really rehab, right? And so
Right.
going out in the field is out of the question. There's only so much office work to do. I had a great employer at the time who was like, you know what? Just go home and chill out. You're driving me nuts. Go home. You know, you won't leave me alone about giving you more office work. Just go home. I'm going to pay you regardless. Just go home, right? Just be
Well, you
around.
can't
So
beat that.
if the guys are going to need something, you can at least be a resource for them, right? So I go home,
Yeah.
but there's a lot of downtime. And I discovered there's only so much Madden I could play on the Xbox before I went crazy,
Yep.
right? And so,
Yep.
and I should have thought about it first, but I didn't. So, but I thought, you know what? I'm going to do something where I'm going to go through my scriptures. So I bought a brand new set of scriptures, and I'm a very tactile guy, right?
Yep.
I like to hold a book. I'm
I
not
do
big,
too.
I'm not big on Kindles or anything else. I'm not saying one's right or one's wrong. It's just how I am.
Right.
And so the first thing I did is I went through that scripture, and every time God spoke, I highlighted it
Yep.
all the way through. Anytime he spoke in the first person, well, obviously in the Doctrine and Covenants, that's 90%, right? But all the way through. And I walked out of that experience with a much deeper testimony than what I'd went into it. And so I
Oh
don't think
yeah.
I don't think the work of ever building that testimony is done.
Oh no.
And so I think that it's in those times, whether you tear your ACL or in the middle of a global pandemic, if we're not using that time to do something other than what I started out doing, which is getting really good at Madden and really sprucing up my fantasy football team,
Yeah. Yeah.
we're selling ourselves short.
My kids, I mean, their generation all grow up with these digital games and these digital formats, would ask me, Dad, why don't you like to play these games with us? And how do you explain to them? Because there is something
Better.
way more exciting
Yeah.
and relevant and significant to our lives than manipulating digital figures on a screen.
Right. Right.
You know, and I mean, it's fun. It's just fun to interact and do some of those things with them. But in terms of spending real time, there isn't anything. I mean, when I'm just too tired to do anything else, I'll sit down and watch some interesting science fiction or something that just fires your imagination, that kind of stuff. But other than that, if I am not, well, we develop addictions,
Sure.
healthy addictions and unhealthy addictions. And this is a real thing. You can develop mental stimuli that you get used to. And if I'm not, because of, we're spoiled today, we have access to the entirety of knowledge of humanity. I can get on my computer and see what James Webb is looking at today, kind of a thing. If I'm not learning something new and exciting every single day, I start to feel depressed.
Right.
That's how addicted I've become to having my brain fed at this enormous rate every single day, every
Right.
day.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about the book coming together. And I just got to ask, because I would dare to say that there probably is. Were there moments at which you're putting this book together during the pandemic that you see the Lord really at work? Small miracles, anything like that?
Well, as we talked about before, I felt like this idea that was put into my mind to produce this in the first place was divine. And I'd had other book ideas that I was going to write something about Joseph Smith, the world's luckiest guesser, kind of a book.
Mm-hmm.
And next thing you know, great LDS author Michael Ash produces Evidences of the Prophet Joseph Smith, which is basically the same thing. And so I kind of half expected someone to write this book before I would be able to get to it. And Daniel Peterson organization, the interpreter, has danced around it a little bit and taken small bites of it, you know, dealing with the Enoch texts. Jeffrey Bradshaw's, you know, he's a great author and has done a lot of work in that regard. But I didn't see anyone who was positioned to do this work. And the more that comes into focus, the more pressure I felt to not blow it. I've been given this idea. I've been given the means and the resources to see it through. Now it's on me. I would lay in my bed at night fretting. How am I going to do this? Where am I going to find the time? I'd wait for everybody else to go to bed and stay up as late as I could working on it or reading. And my wife, who is a saint in every sense of the word, believed in this and ran interference for the months that it took for me to get it done, and didn't worry about where the money was coming from, that sort of thing. That she had to be married to someone who has enough faith in you, and whether she understood it completely or not, but to give you permission and to give you assistance to make it happen is an invaluable gift. So that's once, I'll tell you, we could spend a whole other podcast on my marriage and this woman that I'm married to.
I can so identify with that.
Is heaven. God sent her to me.
Yep. When I came home after my last trip out of town that I would have to take for a long, long time, I showed up and I was unpacking my suitcase, and then it was a new laptop, some microphones, some headphones, and the receipts for some software I bought. And my wife's like, "What's that?" And I was like, "I'm going to start a podcast, and I'm going to profess to the world.
I'm going to start a podcast.
I'm going to tell I'm going to profess to the world that I'm a Mormon fundamentalist, and we're going to talk about some really cool things." And my wife, I mean, she's been nothing but supportive. And what was hilarious, and this is a woman who's had to endure me for going to be 27 years in November. We got married.
Congratulations.
Yeah, we got married young. Moved across the country once, halfway across the country twice. She just looked at it and she went, "You've had worse ideas," and then just really was supportive. Really supported, has been so supportive of this as I've brought people into the house, because I have my where I record is upstairs in the secluded part of the house. Nothing but support. So I can so identify with your statement there that we as men, we get these things to do, but we couldn't do them without our wife.
Yeah, well, so yeah, I it wouldn't have happened without my wife and her support and her belief in this and talking it over with me. And then, of course, the necessary software that came into my hands, the time, the texts that you find serendipitously online. You're looking for one thing and, oh, hey, I need that one too, kind of a thing. And then the means to publish it. Once it was done, it was like, oh my gosh, it's done. It's 400 pages. Now what do I do? The first thing I did, I started giving it away.
Right.
I went on Facebook and I said, I just finished this project. If you want one, message me and I'll attach the PDF. I don't know how many hundreds copies I gave away. Full of typos, by the way, because I hadn't had it. No one had proofread it for me. I think I've since corrected 120 some typos in the book, but I found another one just the other day. It's going to drive me crazy. In any case, then I began to approach various publishers. Also at that time, serendipitously, Mike Ash and Brant Gardner, very fine scholars, LDS scholars, published authors, came to me with some very, very timely and helpful advice. They were so kind and so forth. I've never met either of them personally, but they would take their time out of their busy schedules to be interested in this work, number one, and to be complimentary of it. And then number two, to have constructive input meant a lot. And you read their works and you think, man, I hope this guy's as nice as his book is nice, And
Right.
they are so good. So they gave me some very good advice, necessary changes to make. Not massive changes, just in terms of vocabulary and stuff like that. Very, very helpful. And then, of course, I thought, you know what? Let's see if anybody's interested. So I put it out there. I sent it to, I think, 4 different publishers. Um,
If you don't mind, could you tell us who you send it to?
yeah, before I do that, I realized this book was not Harry Potter. And I wasn't writing this book to be famous or popular to make a lot of money. I don't think I'm making any money on it. I'm advertising it and it's selling, but the advertising is still, and I think I give more away than I sell. Again, that's not why I put this book together.
Mm-hmm.
It would be gratifying to get it in front of more people, but um, so I realized it would not be a great sell to publishers who have to make money. And
Right.
how do you market a concordance? Most
Right.
people don't even know what a concordance is anymore because we don't need them because we have digital databases. But we don't have a digital database for the sum total of extra-canonical writings, which is why this concordance was necessary. So I realized that it was going to be a hard sell. On the other hand, I also realized its utter uniqueness. There is nothing else like it that I have seen. I submitted it to Signature Books,
Mm-hmm.
which publishes Mike Ash, Greg Cofford Books, which publishes Brant Gardner.
Right.
I didn't submit to Deseret Book. I just didn't think I had a shot with that. And I submitted it to the Interpreter, who, although not necessarily a publishing house, have been known to publish books along. So I was targeting more scholarly publishers. The authors that I mentioned before were not very encouraging in regard to their publishers. Their publishers, again, if you look at what they're publishing smaller works that have a broad appeal that will sell.
Right.
So even though in the past they've done scholarly stuff, they're kind of heading away from that because of the almighty dollar. I understand that. In any case, every single one of them were highly complimentary of the book. This is a great work. But in 2 of the cases, Signature and Greg Cofford, they said it's too big. We don't publish text this large. And we don't, and then they asked me, how do you propose to market it? And I'm like, oh, I thought that's why I'm coming to you.
Right.
But I realized that for them to invest, publishing costs money. The Interpreter's response, I was a little disappointed with. They were complimentary of the concept, but they ran it up the chain to their expert in this area, and the expert said that some of the sources I used were not reliable sources. And I wanted to write back and say, what are you talking about? If you look in the extra canonical sources, the annotated bibliography, you can see that each and every one of these 66 texts that I have cited come from reputable scholarly publications. So I'd like to have that conversation with them and say, what were you thinking? You just shooting from the hip because you read things, you saw texts that you were unfamiliar with? Or do you really have issues with some of these texts? I mean, the criteria for the texts that I did use, but they had to be ancient. They had to be as old as the New Testament itself, or they're close. It had to be at least within the first few centuries AD.
Right.
And many of them predate the New Testament. I mean, so they had to be ancient. They had to be authentic. They couldn't be like the Urantia book that some guy received on a hiking trip up in the Uintas or something. It couldn't be that. So I didn't include the very popular Book of Jasher. I did not include that. Book of Jasher is far too late. It's well into the 2nd millennium AD, and it's highly derivative, clearly borrowing from earlier authentic texts. I didn't want to have anything to do with that stuff. It was very important for me that this book could be 2 things. It could be accessible to the average reader if they wanted to dig a little bit, but it could also be respected as a scholarly reference text. And for it to be respected as a reference text, it couldn't have any of my own personal bias in it. So as you read it, you won't see my opinion on anything. I think this or I think that. I don't do that. I simply post as authoritatively as I can the LDS source of an LDS teaching, and then I cite word for word from the extra-canonical texts. And I want that to be very clear, because I don't want it to turn like any source, scholarly source. It can be used in an infinite number of ways. And it has an infinite number of things to teach us or to say to us, because I didn't write that stuff. I just compiled it.
Right.
And I didn't want my commentary to ruin that. It could be so many different, it can mean many different things for many different people. And I'm still working on that. I mean, so I put it together so I could see what it has to say as a whole and what it has to say specific to given subjects and topics, which is mind-blowing still. It seems odd that you would say I'm studying my book, but I understand a little bit about Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon. Doesn't mean he understood it all
Right.
away.
Right.
And he studied it. He studied his own translation, which
Right.
is also evidence of its authenticity. Why would he study something that he made up, you know?
Right. Right. Let me ask you this. I got two questions for you here off of that little piece of conversation we had. What was it like to, after you've spent, sounds like well over 20 years compiling all this information, to have
40 years.
40 years.
40
Okay.
years. 40 years.
To have someone tell you that, hey, your sources aren't up to snuff. Was that kind of infuriating a little bit?
Were I younger and more prideful, it might have, but I've been around this scholarly bush a few times. I had a published dissertation that I presented at an international conference in Philadelphia a couple of decades ago, which was really quite significant in the field of singing. And it was a physiological study of the expiratory mechanism, musculature. And the politics of it stunned me. I mean, I was naive. I thought in the field of science, it either you can prove it or you can't, and nobody can argue with it. But the chairperson of that committee began to argue with me because I had cut in front of her protege who was studying the same thing.
Oh.
And it was like, are you kidding me? And I didn't know she was the chair. She was the national chair of that. But I don't want to name names, but I had people apologizing to me the next day that she would do that to me.
You know, that's funny you should bring
So-
that up. I have
So
a friend.
I have a thick skin. I have thick skin. They said that I wasn't entirely surprised. That's why I'd like to have an honest conversation with them and say, well, which ones? Because they didn't
Right.
bother to do that, which is a red flag.
Right.
Oh, really? Like, which ones are you referring? Which of this you read through all 66 and you're going to tell me? Anyway,
It's funny you should bring that up, because I have a good friend, and I'm not going to name names because he's at a very prestigious university on the West Coast, and he's starting to find now that the assumptions we've had in archaeology for the last 100 years are wrong.
you think
on a lot of things.
That's never happened before.
And he, well, and
Welcome to the world of science.
Yeah, he's the first to admit that, hey, archaeology is really recent, right? It's only been just
100
over
years
100
tops.
years. Yeah.
Yeah.
That we've been doing it, and we're still using a lot of the same models
Yep.
that we used before.
And assumptions.
Right. I mean, right down to the peopling of America, right? Like the whole Clovis,
exactly.
The whole Clovis first doctrine.
Yep.
So he was telling me in a phone conversation once, and he's not LDS, right? And he doesn't have the same kind of dog in a fight like maybe you and I would, talking about the Western Hemisphere. But he was like, it's not about the data, right? The data is secondary to the politics, and it's maddening. And the problem is that they have the ability to turn people into pariahs. The other thing is that a lot of these scholars now are realizing that because of just the prevalence of the amount of knowledge that's available to the average person, greatly it greatly diminishes the idea of the gatekeepers or the middlemen.
You're right.
So
The experts who
the
know everything.
experts, right? So as soon
Yeah.
as you set out to do something like this, you know, his opinion was it's not gathering the data that's tough. It's getting people to at least be open enough to consider the possibilities and the politics that go along with it. And if you're in those circles heavily, if that's your full-time career, good luck on being different, because they'll just defund you as far as grants and scholarships.
Yeah.
My
Yeah.
next question is as you're putting all this together, oh, do you have something you were going to say?
Well, I was finishing the publishing story. Both Brent Gardner and Mike Ash suggested that I self-publish. Mike says that uh, he has enjoyed more self-publishing than having a publisher. Because if you sign with a publisher, there are limitations. So you're talking about these serendipitous things that occurred to make this happen. I got online with I did some research on self-publishing, and the most highly recommended was the Amazon, the Kindle system.
Mm-hmm.
I had that thing published in a night, one night. You get on there, and it is beautiful, and they don't limit you. You can market it, sell it, buy it. You can do whatever you want with it, and they will print on demand. It doesn't cost you anything initially at all. It never costs you anything. You just make money. You upload the PDF, you design the cover, you design the cover material, they assign it an ISBN number, tell you what the cost of it's going to be, you determine the markup you want, you determine the final price. And next thing you know, it's available on Amazon for the whole world to see and to buy. And now they have available, and the printing quality is really quite nice. Initially, it was you could get it in Amazon Kindle. The only thing I don't like about the Kindle formatting is that it messes up the pagination.
Okay.
So the contents and the PDF version I sent you, that's the one you want.
Gotcha.
But the Kindle version, it's nice, and I've sold a lot of those, but the pagination is messed up. But there are people who love to read Kindle. And that's the only way
Right.
that have it. So it was initially available in Kindle and in soft cover, high quality. Now you can get it in hardcover. That was just made available just this last year.
Wow.
So I'm super pleased with that. And
Wow.
I probably give away 2 cases of books a month in addition to what's being sold on Amazon. But if I didn't advertise, I wouldn't sell anything.
Right.
So I run an advertising campaign on Facebook, which is a lot of fun. And it's reasonably priced. And I've experimented with advertising it to thousands a day. And yes, it does sell more, but it doesn't pay back. It doesn't pay for the
Right.
advertising. I'm finding that sweet spot. But what's funny about that, in the advertising process, you have to create a Facebook page for the book, which people can comment on. And I spend hours every single day fielding comments. For better, for worse, most of them are straight up anti-Mormon.
Right.
We hate you, we hate your book, get off my feed, Satan kind of stuff, which is, I think, kind of funny because it tells me that they understand the significance of the book.
Right.
So I take that as a compliment. And whenever possible, I will try it. If they'll give me even one, just one little opening that I can get in there and start having a real conversation with them about why they feel this way, or do they know about this, or have they actually read? I probably 5 out of 100 have actually read the book before they comment.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I know.
It ends up being a defense of the faith. I didn't necessarily want that. I wanted it to be about the book, but at a certain point, you're like, oh, why not? Here we go. I'm happy to
Right.
do that. I've done a lot of that. But it's a lot of fun. You can get it's the Mormon Doctrine and the Apocrypha on Facebook. You can jump in all you want.
Yep. When I first started the podcast, I felt like it was needed for me to defend it. And now I've come to realize, especially on YouTube, right? I'll load some of these up on YouTube, and I'm a fan of post and ghost. I mean, get post it and then get out of there, because you're not changing. I shouldn't say never, but the chances of changing somebody's mind on Facebook or comments in YouTube are just astronomically low, right? I mean, it's not a real conversation. It's just,
However, and I do this a lot. I Anyway, I won't go into specifics, but there have been a number of circumstances where, at the very least, you blunt the
sure,
force. But here's the most important aspect of it. My primary concern, I mean, those people who get on there with flamethrowers and are just looking to damage a person's faith. Like you, I have my doubts about making a dent or finding an opening in their thinking at all. What I'm more concerned with are the innocents who stumble across that on Facebook and are influenced by that. So my fundamental goal in all of this is simply to provide the alternate viewpoint so that people have a choice. They can make informed choices. If all they see is the lopsided anti-Mormon viewpoint, and that's all they know, what chance do they have at making a rational decision, an informed decision? So every opportunity I have, given time, I will happily post the opposing viewpoint, so
sure,
people can see there are multiple sides to any argument, as any true scholar would want.
right,
And
right, yeah,
if you really are interested in the truth, and you're making decisions without exploring all sides of the argument, you are making a decision in ignorance,
yep,
and you'll pay for that.
absolutely. Um, how did you determine what was worthy of going into the book and what wasn't? At what point? And not and that question has two branches, if you will. One is doctrinally significant,
Right.
and then also historically reliable. Does that make sense?
Exactly.
How did you come up with those two criteria on, hey, this should be there, this shouldn't, both from a doctrinal point of view and from a authentic history point of view?
Oh, very good. That's the really great question. The easiest part of that answer is to determine which were ancient and authentic. I started to say if they weren't ancient, if they weren't within the first few centuries AD, I wasn't interested in them. So all 66 date almost as old as the New Testament itself or older. That carries a lot of weight. The whether or not they're authentic has been determined. I mean, when you buy most of these texts come from highly reputable scholarly texts, the Old Testament pseudepigrapha volumes 1, 2, and now volume 3, New Testament Apocrypha now in 4 or 5 volumes. I mean, these are published by the experts in the field and who spend multiple pages before the text telling you how they dated this and what they think about it. So they have very solid reasoning behind whether they would choose to even publish it or call it authentic in the first place. So it's not just me deciding. This is based on the preeminent scholars in that particular field regarding the authenticity of the text. Also, they know the extant copies of those texts tell you a lot about it. For one of my favorite, arguably my favorite extra-canonical work is the Pistis Sophia, one time known as the Askew manuscript, because it was discovered. We don't know where it came from, oddly enough, but we know what it is because we have the original manuscript written on papyrus in Coptic, first person. And it turned up at some London bookseller market. Some grave robber found it in the Middle East somewhere, showed up in London in the late 1700s, bought by a doctor, Dr. Askew, and they call it the Askew manuscript for years. It wasn't translated into English until around 1920. It's 300 and some pages of Jesus Christ teaching his disciples after he was resurrected. He gave them and he had a question and answer session with them. He said, because my work is completed, ask me whatever you want and I will answer you openly. Ooh. So, to tell us about the kingdom of God. And he tells them about the kingdom of God in astronomical terms they can understand. When does the spirit enter the body? Mary asks. He says 70 days. I mean, stuff like that. And you think this is crazy, but the fact is we know that it's ancient. It dates to the first, second, third century on original papyrus. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that blows my mind.
70 days. Okay, hold on, because now I'm fascinated. I got to take a side tangent here.
There are millions, yeah.
70 days from the moment of conception?
Now, here's what's crazy about that. A 2,000-year-old document, he says 70 days when the spirit enters the body. And he says that, and we now know in terms of gestation what that is. That's the 10th week. And what we know in the stages of gestation, the 10th week is when the body is first fully formed. Everything is there. Coincidence? Well, the really interesting thing for me, one of the interesting about Pistis Sophia, is Jesus starts telling his disciples about the degrees of glory and the laws governing the degrees of glory. And then he starts telling them about the ordinances necessary to enter into those kingdoms and to pass through the veils that are guarded. You have to know certain words and certain signs and tokens to pass through these veils in order to reach the kingdom of God. And he tells them what they are. And then after all that, he says, and this is Jesus talking to his disciples. If you know of a righteous disciple who died before receiving these ordinances, you can perform them. You can perform those ordinances in their behalf.
Wow.
And then he teaches them the true order of prayer. Teaches them the prayer circle. The apostles and their wives all line up, dressed in garments of white linen. Jesus standing in the middle of them, and he teaches them how to do it.
Wow. I would like to.
Now that was written by the Gnostics.
Okay.
And when I say Gnostics, the very early Gnostics and the later Gnostics that we hear about, they're not the same.
Okay.
I mean, and that's true for, the Egyptian religion, if you want to call it that. At the very beginning, looks like the temple.
Right.
But over time, they begin adopting everything else and other traditions. And then pretty soon the pharaohs are building temples unto themselves instead of temples unto their God.
Wow.
So that's just the way, what do we call it? The cycle of dispensation apostasy, the apostasy cycle.
Right.
Yeah. Surprise, surprise.
Anyway, sorry, I got us off on a side tangent because I was just like, slow your roll for a second. We're gonna have it. So you're looking for things that are old, right? First century, second century, after the death, burial, and resurrection of the Savior,
and that we have ancient and authentic manuscripts of. We have manuscripts of these things that are truly ancient. So they can be demonstrably proven to be authentic and ancient. That was that side of it. Now, for which texts I would include in my book from the ancient and authentic, because there are lots of ancient and authentic texts that don't say anything particularly about LDS teachings. So as I put in my preface, the LDS teachings listed herein were not pre-selected, but were included simply because they presented themselves in one or more of the extra-canonical works. So I wasn't looking for anything. I was just reading. And when I would come across a teaching that was like, what? What's that doing there? That's what I would mark. So the list of the 179 teachings, I didn't pre-plan any of it. I couldn't. These are just 179 things, different things that presented themselves. And those 179 teachings are each attested multiple times. So we're talking about thousands of attestations of these teachings.
Wow.
The temple, for example, this section on temple rites, it's over 50 pages long. And it attests every aspect of what we do in our temples today. From 2,000 years ago and earlier. And the only people who understand, who get it, are endowed Latter-day Saints. Everybody else is going, well, that's not Christianity.
Right. Right. So is that how you came up with things as far as doctrinally sound? Would you
Yes,
look you would look at it and say, is this something that would be familiar to Latter-day Saints? Was that kind
exactly.
of that was the criteria?
That was the criteria. I was looking to find what I had time to do in my lifetime, in this lifetime, was to find LDS teachings within this body of literature. And it ended up being huge. I mean, it was for me the completion of what Einar Erickson and Hugh Nibley started in finding corollaries between these ancient documents and the restored gospel. And someone said, well, what's the greatest thing you learned from this whole process? And again, I'm kind of tongue-tied because it's massive. But I would have to say the overarching question that has to be answered, that is asked by this text. If these ancient texts really do, I mean, if you take me at my word and you read the book and see for yourself, there are 179 unmistakable, distinct LDS teachings in these ancient texts, none of which were available to Joseph Smith. The question you have to ask is why? How? How's that even possible? I mean, Joseph Smith produced a lot of stuff, more than any other prophet in history, more pages of text. But even so, I mean, so given that, you'd say, oh, I'll give him 6 lucky guesses. But 179 in incredible specificity, surprising specificity, names, and dates, and years, and ordinances, and specific words, all in the same context that Joseph Smith gave to us, which to the modern world was utterly foreign. Everybody was like, that's crazy. No one believes that. Well, 2,000 years ago, they did.
Right.
How do you explain that? And I've actually had a very few thoughtful people try to explain that, who acknowledge the significance of what that is. How did Joseph Smith channel ancient Christianity, or even pre-Christianity, ancient Judaism? How did he channel that?
Yeah.
Well, he secretly had access to the book of First Enoch, which was the first of the apocryphal texts to be translated. It was translated in 1820 in England.
Yeah, that's not making its way over here that quick.
In Palmyra,
Yeah, no.
and this 20-year-old punk is reading it, and that's a stretch. And even if, for the sake of discussion, let's say he did have a secret copy of the Book of Enoch under his pillow. Book of Enoch doesn't account for, what, 2% of the teachings presented in that book. I
Yeah.
mean, First Enoch is significant, but doesn't even begin to cover the gamut of what was restored through Joseph Smith. So he was either the luckiest guesser, or he was magic, or he was telling the truth, is what we're left with.
Right.
I had one gentleman try to explain it. He said, well, it's the teachings of Plato were in the air at the time, and he was channeling Plato. I'm like, first of all, Plato, the Greek philosopher Plato.
Well, I know who you're talking about. I'm
Yeah, I
just
didn't
trying
want to be Plato, right?
Right.
That either, I would be surprised if Joseph Smith knew who Plato was. And as I pointed out to this commentator, that the teachings of Plato were non-specific. I mean, we're talking about Old Testament characters, Melchizedek and Shem and Abraham, very specific, and Enoch in very specific ways. I mean, even identifying how long Enoch lived when he was translated. Joseph Smith did that. Nobody else knew about that until the discovery of these documents.
Right.
And now it's all there.
So does in what you were seeing, because Joseph did a lot of I guess you could call it seership or revelatory work
Sure.
concerning the Old Testament, right?
Yes.
We have the inspired version and that sort
By
of
command, God kept after him. You need to get back to the inspired version of the Old Testament. Do you know why? The majority of the Doctrine and Covenants came from that work.
Yep.
The majority of his revelations came from the inspired version of the Bible.
Let me ask you this. do you see anything in the Apocrypha that's a bullseye in terms of Joseph's work in the Old Testament?
Yeah. Let me count the ways.
Just a few,
Enoch.
just a few that jump out at you.
Let me go through this real quickly. In terms of Enoch, the bullseyes, well, let's talk about Abraham. An angel saying to Abraham, 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 that Abraham desires great knowledge, that Abraham learned astronomy from God, that Abraham received an angel from God, that Abraham was seeking the one true God, that Abraham was shown all things, that Abraham taught astronomy to the Egyptians. That's not biblical. That comes from our book of Abraham. That's
Right.
all attested. That is all attested in these ancient documents
Really?
repeatedly. That Adam could not change before the fall. That's significant to our beliefs of why the fall was necessary. That is attested in these ancient documents. That Adam presides over the human family in priesthood. That is also attested in these documents. That Adam had a very specific language, the Adamic language, also attested in these documents. Then we get to Enoch. Oh, creation is also. We're taught that creation was spiritual and then temporal by Joseph Smith. That is attested in these documents.
Wow.
Verbatim.
And is that in the book?
Oh, I'm quoting from the book.
Oh, okay, good enough.
Perfect. I don't want
Perfect.
to screw up. It's all here, alphabetically. Here's Enoch. We are taught that Enoch was taken to heaven and translated. Literally, that's attested, of course, in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Enoch. That Enoch lived 365 years. That's from Joseph Smith, also attested in these documents. That Enoch sees angels descending. That Enoch weeps for the earth. That's attested. Anyway,
Wow.
those are a few.
Wow.
Melchizedek. Oh, that's good.
So let me ask you this question. We've been at this now almost 2 hours, just a little less than 2 hours. What for people who would say, you know what, that's all good stuff to know, but my testimony is strong and it's sufficient. What good is it to know about these things? What would you tell them?
I would say that's fine. This book isn't for everyone. It is dense and it goes deep. And my favorite missionary companion, Elder Swick, taught me this quote: "There is a hedge that protects the mysteries of God. It is the hedge of revelation. It protects the mysteries from the unprepared, and it protects the unprepared from the mysteries." So that if you're not ready to read this, don't read it. It's not for everybody. On the other hand, people, and we see this a lot in the world, let alone within the church, of people who only want to know this much, right? The prophet Joseph Smith, Joseph F. Smith, Joseph Fielding Smith, Brigham Young, on down the line, all taught that you will only be saved as fast as you gain knowledge, that no man can be saved in ignorance. Or in the Book of Mormon, from him that saith, I have enough, shall be taken even that which he has. Our quest for knowledge is the ultimate determiner of valiance. Section 76 states that only those who will be exalted are those who are valiant in their testimony of Jesus, not just good, which is not a bad thing. And we are who we are. Our degrees of intelligence are inherent in us. And so we will, this is why the plan, that's why agency is the fundamental governing principle of the plan. I can't be smarter than I am. I can't have more intelligence than I have. I can't. I was teaching a gospel doctrine one Sunday. And to drive home this point, I said, raise your hand if you want to be like Jesus. Everybody in their class raises their hand. I said, now raise your hand if you are willing to do what Jesus did. Nobody raised their hand. You'd have to be crazy to do that. Who'd want to go through Gethsemane? Who has the capacity to do that? None of us do. So I don't presume to know where I'm going to end up in the eternities. I don't possess that knowledge and that intelligence. All I know is what I know and what I love and what gives me joy and happiness and fulfillment. And that's what I pursue. And then I have complete and utter trust in the Almighty and the Omnipotent, the Omniscient. On Judgment Day, I'll get exactly what I want, no more, no less. Any more, I couldn't comprehend it. Any less, I would be unfulfilled. That is true for all of us. But I do have concerns for people who purposefully limit their learning. They're setting themselves up for deception. And especially the world in which we live today, the parable of the 10 virgins describes it perfectly. Christ will come at midnight, the darkest hour. The darkness is symbolic of the absence of truth, evil, wickedness, deception, the father of lies. I mean, that's who he is, that's what he does. And the world is filled with darkness. And the only way any of us will be able to survive that darkest hour is by having enough of our own light, right? The lamps, the oil that's in there to provide enough light for us to make our way through the darkness to be part of that second coming, the great marriage feast. And it's funny, of the 10 virgins, the 5 that were foolish, they all had wedding garments, they all had invitations, they all had lamps, and they all had oil, and they were all virgins. So they were righteous, they were endowed, they had the capacity for knowledge, they had some truth, but they didn't have enough.
Right.
So it's not enough, and they got lost. It's not because they were bad. Spencer Kimball, he says the 10 virgins of the church, not the world. They're the righteous endowed. Half of the righteous endowed will have insufficient light to make it to the marriage supper of the Lamb.
Right. I think
That's sobering to me.
And it should be sobering to all of us, right?
Yeah.
And it's something that I remember taking away from the temple is this idea of I got to stop thinking in terms of just tell me what I need to do to get there, right? Give me the checklist, right? When you follow Adam's story, he wasn't concerned with quote unquote just the checklist. It was light and knowledge, right? It was information that could be transformed into wisdom. And that's what I think Mormonism's supposed to be doing for us, right? Is not just giving us that light and knowledge, but sparking our souls in a never-ending quest for further light and knowledge.
Exactly.
Because without that, we cannot attain to what the Father has.
Oh, no.
And we need that light and knowledge, that information, which becomes wisdom to get to where it is we want to be.
The glory of God is intelligence.
Yep. So this idea of I'm just going to work the program doesn't necessarily, I mean, look, I would rather a person work the program than not, sure. But I feel like you're missing out on some of the best perks if you just shut it down at that.
Well, but I've also had to, and being a father teaches us this, we don't all have to be exalted. Not all of us want to be exalted.
Right.
There are kingdoms of glory for everyone relative to their desires and their capacities. And so we get caught in this trap of gold medal, silver medal, bronze medal, baloney. They're all kingdoms of glory, all created for the children that he loves, specifically to fulfill them. And I imagine the terrestrial kingdom will be the most peaceful place in all of eternity.
Right.
The celestial kingdom, we're going to be working our asses off.
No, you're good. I cuss on this podcast.
We'll be working.
You're good.
We'll be working. No, celestial kingdom, there will be struggling, and the heavens will weep because of the work that is being done on behalf of this new eternity.
Right.
and the struggling and the suffering and the sin and the sorrow that is a necessary part of our development. So I confess I used to be pridefully judgmental of people who didn't engage in a scholarly way like I enjoyed doing. But in the end, not everybody has to.
Right.
Not everybody wants to. If you want to do what God does, you have to.
Right.
That's it. But God doesn't say everyone has to do what he does. In fact, Joseph F. Smith said the most interesting thing regarding, he said, the holy priesthood after the order of the Son of God is the only priesthood we know anything about. For every different kingdom or even degree within that kingdom, there's a different order. And the restored gospel doesn't teach us about those orders. It teaches us about the holy priesthood after the order of the Son of God. That's the only one we know anything about. We can surmise what the other orders are about by the choices that people make. And the choices that we make now will determine the kingdom to which we're assigned later, which is a reflection of those choices.
Right.
Like cleaveth to like.
Yep.
We will go where we choose.
Yep. Yeah, I agree
And
with
yeah,
you.
and I love what Elder Holland said. And remember, we're not the first to ask, is there no other way?
Right.
That was asked in the Garden of Eden. Is there no other way? There is no other way. This is how
Right.
it's done. We
Right.
have to choose. Our destinies are self-determined. God does not, God, as the hymn says, God will force no man to heaven.
Yep.
It wouldn't work.
So, one last question before we go. Every book, even a concordance, ultimately has a message behind it. If you were handing this book to somebody else and you had 5-10 minutes to explain to them what this book has meant to you to put it together and what you hope it means to them, what would it be?
Oh. That there is more of God's word. There is more. That's such a hard question to answer when you try and build a reference work. And someone asked us, they said, what was your premise? What was your thesis? I didn't have a thesis. There was so much that I had to compile this to even make sense of it at all. I didn't go about this trying to prove anything. But I will say, having said that, the question, having completed it now, the question really does have to be answered. Why is this book shouldn't exist. I shouldn't have been able to compile 400 pages of Joseph Smith's teachings that turn up in 2,000-year-old documents. That shouldn't be a thing. It shouldn't be possible. And yet here it is. Why? How? How is it? I mean, people should have laughed at me as I started this process. Say, oh, you'll be lucky to, come up with 2 or 3 corollaries. Not 179 multiplied times 4 on the average. How does that? I mean, my skeptical mind is like, okay, I found all these corollaries. How? How did Joseph Smith do that? Why should he even have them? Why should that even exist? Why should that even be a thing? And the only, Occam's razor suggests there's only the most rational explanation is the one that Joseph Smith gave. He wasn't creating anything, he was restoring what has existed in multiple dispensations before on this planet. And my book attests to that. Dispensation of Adam, dispensation of Enoch, dispensation of Noah, of Melchizedek, of Abraham and Moses, and the dispensation of Christ. there is this, they taught the same stuff. Who believes that?
Right.
That's crazy talk outside of Mormondom. That's just crazy stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and I resist encapsulating a 400-page reference work into one polemic argument that undermines what this book can be. But that is probably the largest looming question that's brought up. How is this possible?
Right.
How did he do it? Or did Ken Peterson just make all this stuff up?
Right. Well, I don't know you extremely well, but in these conversations, people inevitably reveal their soul. So I have no doubt that this is not made up, right? You've spent too much time doing it. As I've went through this book now over the last couple of days, I just can't recommend it highly enough. I feel like it can only serve to deepen one's faith and give almost a sense of awe. That's the one thing I've taken away with it, is a continued sense of awe that from the beginning of time to now, the teachings of the restored gospel have always been there. And it has deepened my testimony of Joseph Smith and of his prophetic calling, because for an uneducated guy from the American frontier who can barely write his own name without misspelling it, has somehow managed to come up with all of these bullseyes. Again, I go back to the science of statistical probability. It just doesn't work. You have a better chance of being struck by lightning than you do of finding these things well after his death, buried in a cave on the shores of the Dead Sea, that have sat there for the better part of 2,000 years undisturbed, translated by other scholars that just somehow magically, miraculously line up with what Joseph Smith had said.
Yeah.
So, dude, I so have enjoyed this conversation, enjoyed your book. I got a question for you.
Okay.
Would you be willing to come back on and talk with me at a later date just about the Pistos Sophia?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Would you be up for that?
Oh my gosh, yes.
All right, let's do that.
That would be so fun.
All right, the name of the book: Mormon Doctrine in the Apocrypha, a concordance of teachings of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in extra-canonical writings. And they can find that at Amazon, is that right?
Amazon, yeah.
Perfect.
Or just Google it. Yeah, there are other places that are selling it now, but it's on Amazon where you can buy it.
And
my life's work for $20. You can't beat that.
And it's well worth the $20. I mean, yeah, you're not going to find a better deal anywhere else. Real quick, Ken, if anyone wanted to reach out to you and had questions for you, where can they reach out to you at?
Well, if you go to Facebook,
okay,
and look at Mormon Doctrine in the Apocrypha, that'll get you there.
Perfect.
And then if we want to make personal contact from there, I can message you personal information, and I'm happy to buy anybody lunch and give you a free copy of my book.
Awesome. All right. That was great. All right, everyone. We'll see you next time. Bye.